What family secret was finally spilled in your family? Story 1. That my dad's little sister wasn't really his little sister. It was his sister's baby raised by his mom. The girl didn't know until she was 21. Story 2. My great-aunt was a nurse supervisor at a mental hospital in the 1920s. She fell in love with a guy who was being evaluated for a murder trial. She helped him escape and they went to Florida. But the police caught up with them. My aunt got off easy, but he got the electric chair. I found all this in a newspaper archives while working on family history. Showed it to my mom and she admitted it was all true. Story 3. My de facto uncle. He and my aunt never married but have been together since well before I was born, with a few hiccups. Has a child with another woman. It became common knowledge when the girl was 6 and was starting to understand the situation. At first, it was a bit scandalous, but she's been welcomed with open arms by my entire family, including her half-siblings' maternal grandparents. She's treated the same as all the other kids her age. Her half-sister, my cousin, has a daughter the same age and they're best friends, go to the same high school, totally inseparable, technically aunt and niece, haha. She comes to all our family events and she's an awesome kid. We're all stoked to have her in our family. Story 4. My mom was having an affair with a schizophrenic dude she met in a bar, got pregnant, and just let her husband believe I was his my whole life. When she was sick in the hospital and looped out drugs, she's starting mumbling on about my dad not being my real dad. 23, and me test later and secret's out. Story 5. About a month ago, my mother-in-law's 88-year-old sister revealed on her deathbed that her husband's best friend was actually the father of all 4 of her children. Her husband was an abusive grade-A jerk by all accounts. While everyone was shocked, no one was saddened by this news. Story 6. My great-great-grandfather was a huge financial success in the 1920s. Owned a bunch of businesses, pillar of the community type, half the town worked for him, built himself a huge mansion at the edge of town with all the modern conveniences, lost everything in the stock market crash of the Great Depression, went out on his front porch, sat in a chair, and blew his head off with a shotgun. Everybody was involved in covering it up, not just the family, but the local authorities and the newspapers too. His obituary even said that he had died of natural causes, though the whole town knew better. It was passed down as legend for generations that he had died young of natural causes, though no one ever mentioned why the family was suddenly poor. I found an entry in my great-grandmother's diary long after she had passed where she wrote about the whole episode. Story 7. This just came out about a month ago when my sister did a 23andMe. My grandfather on my mother's side was supposedly born and raised on the reservation, 100% Native American. Well, my sister did a 23andMe a while back, and it had 0% Native American in her results. She started doing a little digging and found out our grandfather was not only born someplace completely different than he said, but also 10 years earlier. This has left my family completely confused because neither my grandfather or grandmother are here to sort this out any longer, or explain why this dude shaved 10 whole years off of his life and lied about being raised on the reservation. He also had very Native American features, some of which I've inherited, which also leaves me wondering a bit. Elol, I did ask my mom, jokingly, if she brought the wrong baby home from the hospital when she brought my sister home, but she insists that is not the case. LOL. Story 8. My mom might not actually be my biological mother. I'm a surrogate baby, and was told my entire life, even though my mom didn't birth me, I am 100% biologically my parents' kid. Well, I've been wanting to get one of those 23andMe things done because I thought learning more about my family could be cool, but my mom was super against it. She kept referencing the Golden State Killer as her argument for the government using my DNA against me or someone else in the family, and I was like, Mom, they caught a serial killer. I'm pretty sure that's a good thing. Also, she's not a conspiracy nut in any other way than specifically this, so I thought her reaction was very odd. Anyways, I was out grabbing a drink with my dad a few weeks ago, and I was like, Hey, BTW, why is Mom so weird about me getting a 23andMe test? And he explained that actually donor eggs were in the mix because my mom's eggs weren't taking, so there's about a 50-50 chance I am not in fact biologically related to my mom, and my mom's a bit freaked about me finding out. I don't actually care. My mom is my mom 100%. I'm just curious about my genealogy. I also want to have kids eventually, and would very much like to know if there's anything I should be looking out for. Not a super dramatic thing. I mean, I guess it is to my mom, but not to me. I'm not traumatized by this, and actually it kind of makes sense because I look exactly like my dad. But the few features that aren't my dad's aren't my mom's either. I don't look like her side of the family at all. The only thing my mom and I have in common is that we're both blonde, but my dad is also blonde, so... Story 9, I found it and spilled it. It doesn't affect anything other than family history, though. Let's call my dad's family name Little Fly. It's the approximate English translation. I was researching the Little Fly family history on Heritage. I knew we came from France, but that was it. I followed back no problem until the early 1800s. Then, I found an anomaly. There was a man and woman who had children together. The man's last name was Bell, made up, can't remember. And the woman's name was Little Fly. Half the kids had the Little Fly last name, and half had the Bell last name. What? Turns out Mr. Bell was married to a completely different woman. They had no children together. Mr. Bell and Ms. Littlefly had like 5 or 6 kids together while the Bells were still married. From what I can tell, Ms. Littlefly lived in the same house as the Bells. This wasn't a wealthy family either. The best I could figure, they gathered reeds from the swamp for fires. Mr. Bell may also have worked on the ferries. I'm not sure. It's all in French. I'm not French, and my Heritage subscription has run out. So, our family was born of an affair. I now don't know if I should follow the Bell line or the Little Fly line. Story 10. We did an ancestry DNA test and found out my dad has a half-sister. Turns out Grandpa had been seeing her mother on the side for probably more than a decade, and also had at least one other long-term affair. Story 11. When I was a kid, my dad spent time in prison. I didn't find out why until he was arrested again. He was caught with CS Sam on the work computer of the business he shared with his friend and got taken down, but he blamed his friend and got a reduced sentence. The second time, it was because he was basically running his own to catch a predator sting. He was going into chat rooms pretending to be a teenaged girl, sending ransomware to people who interacted with him, and blackmailing them to fund his trips to Thailand. One of the people caught in his sting went to the police and he got a few years in prison. And it turned out my father had CSAM on his computer again anyway. I also found out more recently, and less horrifyingly, that my mom was adopted when she was a kid. She talked to her biological father a few times when I was a baby and tried to get in touch with her mom, but she wanted nothing to do with it. She's now in contact with her older half-sister, but they haven't met in person. Edit, clarification. Story 12. We found out after my grandpa died that he had another kid with a woman he met before my grandma. IDK if he ever knew he had a kid. The offspring showed up on one of those ancestry gene websites and said he was open to meeting family, so some of the older cousins went out hunting with him. All this was spilled to me at my cousin's wedding 2 years ago, and I guess people in the family had known for a few years. My parents never told me, and they still don't know that I know. Story 13. My brother was on a TV show called Top Cops, real-life police stories. Anyway, after it aired, he got a phone call from a woman in California, we are Canadian, who recognized our unusual family name. She told him that she was the illegitimate daughter of my grandfather on my dad's side. News to us. Anyway, my dad had already passed, as did his parents, but it was an interesting story. Story 14. When my nanny, Dad's mom, died, it turned out she had a baby at 16, and he died at 1 year and 1 day old. Also found out great-granny got tired of waiting for her husband to come back after he abandoned her and the kids, so she stepped out on the regular. Your husband leaves and makes a new family. We confirmed he had 2 wives. Then has the balls to go back to her like he's on vacation. Yeah, she was like, fuck that. Story 15. My sister and I found out in our mid/late 20s that we had a full-on brother. Our dad got our mom pregnant in high school, and 'cause it was the 60s, it was all hush-hush, and she went to do her senior year with family and just quietly came back to town. They ended up getting together for real in college, and no one knew, not their lifelong friends or even my uncle. Our brother had a good childhood with his adoptive family, but he was always curious about his birth mother, so he wrote her a letter. He sure was surprised to also come to meet his dad and 2 sisters. Crazy thing is, he didn't live too far away and we all look extremely alike. Would have been weird if we'd have bumped into each other otherwise. Story 16. My mom's family is Appalachian mountain folk. L have Native American features. So L asked my mom and got told vehemently that I'm 100% white. So after my mom died, L was going through stuff. Found out that not only was her grandmother, my great-grandmother, Cherokee, but my biological father is also. I found a wonderful picture of my tiny Cherokee GGM standing hand in hand with my incredibly tall Welsh GGP. I treasure that picture. Story 17. My maternal grandmother was very well known in a community in California. She basically started soccer programs in the town when it was first starting. She died in a car accident with her best friend. They crashed into a haystack truck. My grandma left behind 4 children. I think her best friend left behind 5. There's a soccer field named after her with a plaque describing how much she meant to the community. One Thanksgiving, my grandpa and grandma, his next wife, told me that my grandpa knew the first officer on scene personally, and he called him up immediately. Before anyone else got there, they removed the alcohol bottles out of the car before anyone else can see. Nobody from the other family knows they were shit-faced when they died. A prevailing theory in my family is that they were lovers and committed suicide. Story 18. Through FB, I discovered my grandpa Nick had an entire other family on the East Coast. He moved his first wife to the West Coast, claiming he wanted the son. After he passed, we found out there is an entire other family that thought they were his only family. What a mess. Story 19. I came home from my first semester at university and told my mom on the way to Sam Goody that all of the people I'd recently met had really interesting family stories and skeletons in their closet, and that we were boring because we had none. My mother, who grew up in the rural southern U.S. and was raised Catholic, who later married my Southern Baptist father, told me that if I wanted skeletons, she had a doozy for me. I thought I was the youngest of the two of my mother's children. I thought I only had an older brother. Turns out, in rural NC in the late 1950s, she became pregnant. Her boyfriend, Paul, wanted her to abort and offered to pay for it. I shudder to think about what that procedure would look like in that place and time. She was sent to a home in Ohio for unwed mothers. Only her mother, her aunt, and her best friend knew why she went away. She gave birth to a daughter, Paula, who she held for a few minutes before the baby was whisked away. She has never tried to find her firstborn, the older sister I had, and remains unsure how she'd react if her daughter reached out to her. My mother turned 80 late last year. Story 21. Servers usually make $2, $3 an hour and rely on tips to survive. Telling them you're not going to tip is basically a slap in the face, and you will get poor service because they're not going to consider you a priority. There is a movement here to start paying servers a livable wage so they don't have to be dependent on tips, but that fight has a long way to go before it is the standard. Story 22. Don't tell and don't tip. Why? Well, you see, I was Uber Bolt driver for some time in my country, and every time tourists from USA come, I was expecting some tip. I didn't demand and I said nothing. And Americans, and typically Westerners in general, didn't ever tip. Except for Germans. They did tip sometimes, but Americans no, so therefore I wouldn't give them courtesy of tipping because it's a bit of hypocrisy. Story 23. Hey, American here. A number of things could happen. You may be asked to leave immediately. Oregon, at the end of your meal when you get your check, tip will automatically be added to it because of what you said. Oregon, the waiter will laugh at you and may not serve you. I think the first two situations are most likely to happen. You'll either immediately be asked to leave if it's a sit-down restaurant, or at the end of your meal, a tip will be automatically added. Story 24. Adapt to the countries you are visiting. By not tipping, you are directly harming the waiter-waitress, and not the business. By announcing beforehand that you plan not to tip, you risk having your food messed with or having bad service. It's fine to have a moral stance against tipping, but you are planning to penalize the waitstaff for it. And they depend on tips as a core part of their income. A single person refusing to tip doesn't change anything for the system overall. It just harms the poor staff who are already forced to be paid this way. Maybe don't travel to countries where tipping is the norm if you feel that strongly about it. Story 25. I'm not from the US either, but if you visit a country, you adapt to their customs. If the waiters only get a living wage with tips, it doesn't matter that you finding the system stupid, which I agree with. You tip. If you don't, despite knowing that the waiter needs it to get a decent wage, you're just an ass. In Rome, do as the Romans do. Story 26. I've done that before when I was too broke to pay for the entire cost of the meal. That's what tipping is supposed to be, a sliding scale. So wealthy people voluntarily pay a bit more for the same meal as poor people. When I was a waitress, people did this, and we actually treated them really well because we felt sorry for you. We had this couple who came in with loose change at least once per week and ordered the fries with cheese sauce, the most calories for your buck. They were both skinny and their clothes were clean but well worn. They weren't lying about being broke. The chef would make them a huge tray of fries with cheese sauce, and sometimes I'd buy them fountain drinks. The fact that they were upfront about being too broke to pay me for their portion of my labor meant a lot. You'll be fine. Story 27. This is very interesting. I'm American, and I always tip 20%. When I don't want to tip, I don't go to a place where I will be served by someone. My parents worked in the service industry and depended on tips. I tried to do the same, but I couldn't cut it. It's actually quite challenging for some of us, and the skills and talents of those who are good at it are undervalued, underrated. Immo. Anyway, what interests me is how this is even a question. Isn't a statement like that obviously rude, condescending, hurtful, devaluing, etc.? What am I missing here? Maybe it's a translation issue if you're coming from a place where English isn't widely spoken. Still, even then, isn't the sentiment just totally rude and mean? Story 28. You're either going to become their last priority since you aren't contributing to their pay, or it will become a priority to fuck with your food and give you an awful experience. If it isn't normal in your country, that's fine. But if you come here and don't obey the customs, then it's on you. Story 29. I wouldn't do that considering the risk of defiling your food. Just don't tip. People preaching adapting to culture are full of BS. Don't facilitate this terrible practice. It's not your responsibility to pay a living wage, that's the employer's responsibility. Tipping is for excellent service and going the extra mile. I'm not tipping someone for doing their work. For that, we already pay the normal bill. Story 30. What you have to understand is that in North America, servers in bars and restaurants do not make minimum wage. They are paid a server's salary, and the expectation is that the tip from the customer will make up the difference so that they are making a salary equivalent to the minimum wage. This is not stupid. While in some countries servers are paid a decent salary, e.g. Australia, in North America this is not the case. I think it is incredibly rude behavior that you would not tip when you are being waited on. If you don't want to tip, then maybe you shouldn't go to those establishments. Story 31. You say that you wouldn't expect the server to go above and beyond. However, my guess is that you would still expect good service and would be annoyed if you didn't receive it. In an ideal world, a waiter should provide the same level of service to everyone, but in the real world, I doubt that a waiter is going to provide the same level of service to you as they would to their other tables who are going to tip them. By not tipping, you're hurting your waiter and yourself. Whether you like the tipping system or not, it's how things work at sit-down restaurants in the US. When you choose to eat there, you are becoming a part of that system and basically agreeing to tip. If you don't want to tip and not be a jerk, go to a restaurant where there aren't waitstaff. I do agree with you that sometimes there are situations where it seems a bit outrageous to have to tip, like at a drive-thru or at a restaurant where you aren't actually served and only place your order at the counter. In those scenarios, however, my general impression is that tipping isn't an unspoken requirement. You're just being given the option to do so if you choose. That's when you tip if you receive amazing service or if you just feel nice. I will always remember the customers who tipped me while I was working at a drive-thru fondly, but I didn't get mad at those who didn't. One last note. When making your decision to tip, it might be worth figuring out where the tip goes and how the worker is being paid. For example, when I worked at a pizza place, there was an extra charge for delivery, and it was also expected that you tipped the drivers. Some customers wouldn't tip because they, understandably, expected that the delivery charge went to the drivers as their tip when it didn't. In such situations, it doesn't hurt to ask. Story 32. I have always wondered who, though it was a good idea to pay the servers as little as possible, then supplement their income with the kindness of strangers. I have a follow-up questions to servers if they would be kind enough to indulge me. If you were paid a shift wage of, let's say, $18/hour or more, would you be inclined to always give good service, or does a tip count as the incentive? I can understand both sides of the argument, but I honestly think the best answer would come from the public-facing people of the front end.